Our penultimate speaker at IAD 2018 works out of Denver and Ahmedabad. Her work is culturally and works very extensively with culturally and environmentally contested sites in incredibly different geographies. These range from Denver to Egypt to Odisha. She's also the founding member of the Anant Raje Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome Shubhra Raje.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. It has been quite an incredible weekend. So many resonances and concerns, some continuities, some divergences. But it is a privilege, so thanks again. I'm going to start with a little folk tale that perhaps some of you might be familiar with. One dark night, a woman was searching intently for something in the street. A passerby asked her, "Have you lost something?" "Yes, I've lost my keys," she said. "I've been looking for them everywhere." "Where did you lose them?" "I don't know, maybe inside the house." "Then why are you searching for them here?" "Because it is dark in there. I don't have any lamps, and I can see much better here, under the light." I thought the story, I thought the story might help us this evening to wander a little bit away from the primacy of vision and the compulsion of visibility that we subject ourselves to as architects. I'm, I think, going to talk mainly to practicing architects here. Most of architecture, its conception, comprehension, documentation, and dissemination is conducted in well-lit spaces, as we have seen in many presentations, especially the ones of the photographers, where architecture has been, in those famous words, again, I think we all know who it is, the masterly, correct, and magnificent play of masses brought together in light. And in these we have found many, many precious things. But if we were to move into the proverbial indoors of the work of architecture, the practice of architecture, and into the expressive culture of the intimate, the fragile, the hidden, and the ephemeral, what might we find? There is a sustained illusion here that the work of architecture, and whenever I say the work of architecture, I'm really meaning the larger project of architecture, that the work of architecture be returned to the stuff of life, rather than it be an autonomous art form, a visual art form, also something which we've seen a lot of. Not all elements, or even the structures of everyday life, are always evident, but they do become part of our habitus, as part of the experience of lived practices. I'm interested in conditions rather than moments that momentarily reveal the facade, so to speak, of these structures and the documentation and the occasional disappearance of context understood as lived practice. Most of you might be familiar with this, the Karasas test. For those who don't, the test investigates the relationship between earth, water, and air, and is expressed through a diversity of form, as you see there, consistency and texture of the resulting material. My first experience of performing this test was in a workshop on earthen architecture in Austria, and it made quite an impression on me. As a group, it seemed that we were predisposed to one outcome, which led to the inevitable comparisons of each other's samples, even though each sample was unique in terms of its type of earth, quantity of water, and degree of compaction. Tellingly, the perfect samples within the group were deemed ones which held their shape, the form, with the greatest degree of precision. And you can all probably guess which ones. Because we were all fixated on this as a mold, the generator of form, rather than measure. This tendency of homogenizing outcomes through an innate need for benchmarking was despite the fact that the ignoble-looking slurry is what you would need to plaster, or a viscous goop would be more workable in the summer, and so on. It seems our preponderance for ubiquity and the notions of perfection are what make us forget to truly celebrate diversity for what it is, and that is an expression of context. In many cases, the end result is presented as though it is inevitable. The work of architecture becomes a reduction to an aha moment of inspiration. All liveness is evened out, flattened, and a formal distancing is established. I would like to point out here and clarify that this is not a critique of the outcome, that is falling water, but it is, but of the mythology of that to that. The ideation materialized and the documentation as evidence of that materialization. Critical practice, including its documentation, must deal with the specificity and inclusivity of context and how to make it relevant to the design process. So rather than documentation as transparent windows onto the work of architecture, perhaps it is an opportunity to think of it as an interrogative tool, to make the method and experience of the liveness of context knowable. Certain conditions we encounter as architects while practicing call into question how to record, when to record, and indeed what can be recorded to allow context to emerge. Oops, sorry. Yeah. So to begin with, of course, there is the condition of meeting. How does one document a meeting? Climate, site configuration, the cycles of the sun, parts of the wind, bylaws, codes, cultural narratives. It seems as if the complexity of discourses has assumed that a landscape cannot be known unless all the informational elements and narratives have been incorporated, leaving unrecognized the predominant encounter with it, that of the interaction of the physical body within the landscape. These interactions are the beginnings of familiarity for me, in that they need our presence. It is a mode of engagement which allows us to begin not with a literate reading of the place, but with the physical acuity and specificity that accompanies inserting oneself into the environment. Through one's body, one explores the built environment not with one's eyes, but up close, making the work deeply personal. Two examples. This was a precursor to design, a workshop with international architecture students visiting the city of Ahmedabad for the first time. Here the inhabitation was through the practice of play. There were no measure tapes allowed, no sketchbooks, no phones, no recorders. Play here refers to very, very material games played by the participants. Most of them were adaptations of plays they were already familiar with. And to use these games as a stimulus to experiencing the city and not as an observed strategy. The point was not for them to observe and document what others were playing. The challenges and risks for the participants experiencing Ahmedabad for the first time were ones of inserting themselves into the context. The experiences were brought back into the workshop through oral tellings, again, no visuals here, in their native languages, which were then followed by self-translations into English. This being a workshop with architecture students, the workshop culminated in the participants housing the tellings within an environment that evoked the significant quality of their telling, and this was the dissemination. The second is a precursor or a setup for construction. Oftentimes, construction sites become places of meeting. The building culture, meeting the building culture of a region. Not a romanticized version of regional architecture, but because labor and craft in our age of transience is a very fluid context. As Madhav mentioned, I work in very, very sort of peripheral conditions of all sorts. So for each set of specifications and documentation, a tactile and material translation becomes an opportunity for knowledge to be embodied as a lived experience. We involve our clients, site supers, and the laborers, and the tests and workshops become way to experience specifications. Numbers, like visuals, are abstract, and sort of reviving a feel, a body memory for materials becomes very helpful. Some of these are resonant over the presentations, probably over 4 days of presentations. The second question really comes to mind is, when does one document? When does one determine that a construction is finished? To take the term literally, building under construction reveal where they are built. That is how a construction region most commonly works and builds. More than any formal or aesthetic appropriation of details, motifs, or styles, the peculiarities of the ways in which a construction society operates, measures, and monitors itself reveals the building culture of a place, not merely how it has always been, but the slow shifts and imports and exchanges, and what I like, that is its culture of play, or how it finds its release. I'll give a little explanation. But in a unique way, play has materiality. To realize itself, play must be enacted rather than thought about. So this is a construction site at Abydos, the project Madhav talked about in Egypt. The steel scaffolding is a relatively recent import. It's systems of assembly incorporated within a region of masonry. The season of 2012 ended with what you see on the right-hand side here, where the crew involved with 3 months of sort of assembling and dismantling scaffolding as and where it was needed for the monument, gathered all of the scaffolding, and the challenge for them was in how tall they could go without a collapse. It wasn't required, it was free of the conservation work, but I suppose the crew thought necessary to demonstrate perhaps their growing confidence and capability, an installation. How wonderful. And the happy consequence, of course, was this wonderful aerial shot, pre-drone era. Or sometimes on construction sites, you have the occasional flourish of migrant workers, in this case, plastering base coat in Orissa. It is significant, though, for us to understand that the players themselves in both cases know that the play by its very nature is transient. This is not meant to last forever, even in their minds, and that in its practice occupies liminal spaces, the in-betweens, in process, not in form. In its potential to transcend need, play reveals the possible, but also what already stands as a structure or context. Play is sensed as an equalizer that momentarily removes the construction site's natural divisions, creating ephemeral common grounds. The expectation of what looks and constitutes finished, and the questions of which technologies and products constitute relevance in a particular situation or geography, whether time decays from day one or whether materials are enriched by time. For example, a glossy finish on an office table made of wood, itself a noble material, often the glossiness doesn't give the opportunity for scratches to gain value. Or there is the tyranny of our expectations as architects with the material. Here, for instance, it's the opposite, the locally sourced, natural, untreated wood. On the floors, walls, ceilings, tables, chairs, it was everywhere. Used in reformation of an old boarding house into an agricultural vocational building in Altmünster. It also was the location of the earthen workshop that I talked about earlier. Unfinished, made to behave as though it was glossy, installed not to age. The aesthetic or technical criteria are the ones, it seems, with which we evoke architecture these days, instead of imagining them as resonant settings and backgrounds for situations of lived life. This is how we were, and this is how we were meant to occupy this ultra-clean building. It was almost ridiculous. The building and its sustainably sourced materials completely intolerant to any form of detritus or decay. The ideal being that the building continues to look as though it was new, instead of it being about the ability for the built to let time reflect on things, of how far we can stretch that sense of it still being made in a continuous present of sorts. Under construction is also a condition that extends to the culture around maintenance, which most of us deny along with our clients. A collection of memories from the everyday rituals of taking care and tinkering to weekend DIY projects and seasonal and annual cycles of renewal. Each of these conditions that I've sort of tried to highlight are part of the architectural project and are an opportunity for complexities to emerge in context rather than attempting to freeze their fluidities insofar as accepted modes and moments of documentation. This brings us to the conundrum of what can be documented and what of disappearance, given that one of the most recurring definitions of liveness is that it is fundamentally ephemeral. There is a condition within the practice of architecture that toys with our need for making visible the purity of our ideas and efforts, the renovation project. In most cases, the work dissolves or integrates in a way a transplant organ must. Both parties, the host and the transplant, are at play here. In the integration, there is the disappearance of the architectural gesture, revealed in the subsequent performance of the reconstituted whole. Clearly, I'm not talking about the glamorous interiors project here, but one where one gets asked, so what did you do exactly? Or worse, is it even architecture? But there is a proximity here, in that one has to deal with complexities of an existing or found situation head-on. A renovation takes into account existing situations, most often in very dire conditions, and with an economy of means that may never find its way into lists or metrics of sustainable rating systems, reconstitutes it into a form that works better, performs efficiently, and makes the stitching of the old and the new as effortless as possible. The previous set of slides was a youth arts organization in the urban peripheries of Denver, where it was important to remain in the neighborhood. This is a rehabilitation project of a 5,000-year-old funerary structure in Abydos, Egypt, where the goal has been to preserve the structure as a ruin, with the new material limited to where it was necessary to stabilize existing walls, so that the genesis of the structure and how it changes as things are rubbed out and drawn over, while traces of an entire set of histories, and there was a huge set of histories from the early Pharaonic kingdom to the Coptics, to abandonment, to Arab raiders, to pagan cults, to the scavenging early Egyptologists looking for King Tut and other glamorous mummies, and all these histories continue to be clear rather than restore it to some original early kingdom structure. We also come to, in documentation, what does one exclude? And this, I think, is particularly sort of ironic in this setting. Proper behavior in architecture is often expressed through our unquestioned reverence for silence. Clearly, I'm not very good at it. Its coupling with light institutes that a building's qualities, and more importantly, its behavior, is revealed through shadows, subtle textural ones, deep volumetric ones, you know how it goes. For light and shadow qualify space and form, express materiality, and make visible the passage of time. Perhaps this is why there's an in-season and an off-season, a right time and a wrong, or at least an unfortunate time, to our efforts to document built environments. We hardly see moments of buildings in sort of moldy monsoons, or feel cheated when an icon is under construction. We feel, and we try to edit out our hostility to things we have become intolerant to because they don't fit into the materialization of our ideation. But they are details of our times, right? Whether it is for the aged in San Gimignano or the poopers. Joseph Brodsky writes that the city of memory is empty because for imagination, it is easy to conjure architecture rather than human beings. But architecture, I'm sure you would agree, is meaningful only in the interaction and resonance with life, real, remembered, or imagined. The behavior of Sept Campus, for instance, in August of 2012, as documented by a student. Space, its meaning, is created by the interaction of the body and the ground. It is where you make contact with architecture in a very foundational way and in the simplest and most intimate way. The pleasures, the pains, comfort, or revulsion, depending on what meets your feet. The process of creating intimacy, then, is not just a matter of engaging emotions, but engaging the intelligence of the body to register and record and create memories. An architecture working from its memory, that is context. And what we have built now becomes part of the context and can no longer exist autonomously, and the cycle of meeting begins again. We design from what we remember. Inventions do not exist per se in isolation, like the aha moment we seem so want to disseminate, as what architecture creativity is. That connection between what we remember and our present context, that is fertile ground. I work alongside theater makers and storytellers to create conditions using the body to challenge, review, and rethink our built environment and the context of architecture. Working this way, using the body to both record and examine, creates moments of being held in place and at some time loosens the embeddedness brought about by the familiarity of habit, so that a known place can be looked at anew, its physical characteristics and potentials revealed occasionally, often disregarding representational ones. This was a piece of device theater situated in a building I designed in Denver, where along with middle school kids, the building and the spaces are a major part of the devising work. And each situation in the script is informed by the built conditions. They're little urban meditations on the theme of belonging. The audience moves from location to location in the building, and as they move, the production and the environment is constituted. Another example of devised work, similarly, this one was situated in a community hospital's pain management ward. Stories of hope and pain are set into corridors and hallways and examination rooms, and the architecture of the building itself, a creative partner to the participants. The movement of the audience was very similar to the last one. And finally, a more scripted work in which I was an audience, I wasn't a collaborator, located in an abandoned pool, letting us experience the spatiality of the pool, its topography, its cavernousness, which otherwise gets hidden with a sheet of water. So I encountered Tardot through a lecture by Palasma. But it was such a powerful provocation that it has remained with me, and I thought I would end with this. In the context of the theme of this event, one wonders if the act of documenting becomes less about representing thought, the evidence, and returns in the hands of the architect as a tool of thinking. Thank you.